In this video I will teach you how to play the King's Gambit, and we will be taking a look at all the variations where black doesn't capture our pawn on f4. So there are basically 4 different lines that we will need to cover. About 50% of games black will capture, and in that case you will have the King's Gambit accepted, which I already made a video about, but it can be a bit more difficult sometimes if black doesn't capture. So the first thing we are going to take a look at is what if black plays the knight to c6, which is the most popular move in this position if they don't take the pawn. So the simple idea for black is that we are attacking their pawn in the center. We are really always trying to build the strongest center possible, and black is trying to prevent this by guarding the pawn. So we will have to continue, and we are going to play our knight to f3, which is a very basic move in the King's Gambit, of course, because we want to stop the queen check if we can, and also this knight also helps put pressure on this pawn on e5. And there are a couple of things that can happen. Of course, in all of these variations, black can always at some point still decide, okay, I'm going to capture on f4 anyways, in which case you usually play this. You also have the chance to recapture this with the bishop, and this is very similar to all of the King's Gambit accepted lines that I have already covered. There are other things possible as well. The most popular move probably is to play pawn to d6, because black needs some extra reinforcement here on this pawn. Sometimes you can also see black playing the bishop to c5, and usually when this happens, that means we are going to be able to win a pawn, because of course we have 2 attackers on e5 and black only has 1 defender. So if we capture this, my recommended move order is to capture with the knight. You might get a trade like this, and you would be thinking, I'm going to recapture with the pawn, but that would be a terrible mistake because of queen h4 check, and let's say we block the check, queen takes here, and we also lose the rook. So yes, we can capture with the knight, we can play this, but you have to be very careful that you never recapture here. And in general, whenever this bishop is here, always be really careful that you don't run into nasty queen checks. And the best move here is simply playing pawn to d4. And okay, we are down a knight because we captured the pawn, but yeah, this is clear that we are also going to be winning back some material. Multiple things are possible, of course. They can always capture here. They can also move the bishop, in which case, for example, if they move the bishop, you can simply take the knight. The best thing is actually to take like this and still have a solid center here. Because again, whenever you do something like this, which would be a blunder, you always run into the queen check, and also this pawn is going to fall. But here we don't have the same problem, of course, because the bishop is defending this. So yeah, this is the plan. Sometimes they will capture, you can recapture with the queen. They can still give you the check, but we can block with the queen and everything is fine. Even this, which looks a bit strange, is perfectly fine for white. We still have the pawns and the center. We are going to have better development and an easy game. You have to be careful here that you don't block with the pawn again, because otherwise you suddenly get this check. Okay, I know we are also attacking their queen, but it's all a bit complicated. Most of the time though, you are just going to get black to play this instead of the bishop c5 line. They will play knight to c6 and also pawn to d6. So they are really trying to hold on to this pawn and protect it. So we are going to continue, and the fun thing is for white, it actually doesn't matter too much what you play. Basically everything is playable. I would recommend bishop to b5, because in many of these lines we are simply going to be winning this pawn here on e5. And we are already attacking it twice, but by playing the bishop here, it's pretty easy to remember this. We are just trying to eliminate the knight as a defender for this pawn. Yeah, it's pretty simple. If they play something like, for example, pawn to a6, you can take, and you can already see that in these variations, this pawn is basically unprotected. You just have to be careful that you don't run into any traps. So most of the time, the best thing, for example, if they block with bishop to d7, the best thing to do is actually to defend this pawn on e4 first. And many players are impatient and they think, okay, I'm going to go this, and then I might go in with the knight or something. But yeah, all of a sudden you are running into a lot of problems. So you always have to make sure that you are protecting this pawn on e4 first. And basically now we are actually threatening to just capture and win some material. And the most played move by black is actually pawn to a6, which immediately loses the pawn because of course we take, we can grab all of this, and it might look scary. Black still has this check, but yeah, we can just block with g3 and nothing's really going on. And at some point we are just going to be able to, for example, trade, and yeah, white just has a good position and we also have an extra pawn. So that is really how it's going to go most of the time. Other moves are possible, of course. For example, they can play knight to f6 as well. But yeah, again, you can just go and win a pawn. Sometimes they are just going to take because they realize that otherwise they are going to lose the pawn. But if they take, you can always take with the bishop, and it's still a really good position for white. Next step, we have something which is quite a good defense, I would say, for black, and that is the Fischer defense. So that means we play e4, e5, pawn to f4, and here black plays pawn to d6 immediately. Okay, which makes sense, of course, because they are defending the pawn. And then we play knight to f3, or logical move, because we also want to stop the check. But now they can take. And the difference with this line and the regular King's Gambit accepted is, of course, this pawn is already on d6. Which means that many of the other lines that are possible usually are not possible here. Of course, other things are also playable. Knight c6 is also very common, but that will transpose to the previous variation that we just covered as well. So the problem with if they play this is, of course, we can still play pawn to d4. We want to go and win this pawn, but black can actually, if they have studied this, if they know what they are doing, they can go for pawn to g5, and they are really trying to hold on to this pawn advantage that they have. They might also just play other moves. For example, this is actually the most popular move, but yeah, we just captured the pawn and everything is perfectly fine for black. For white, of course, not for black. But this is fine for black if they play this move to pawn to g5. And if you have studied the King's Gambit accepted, you probably know that, okay, we are just going to attack this pawn, that's the plan, and we want to try and win back the pawn, basically. And most of the time, black will push. Sometimes they will also try to defend, but of course, if they do this, they are losing the rook. They can also try to defend like this, but again, yeah, it's not so good for for black if they open up this entire position. For example, something like this. But most of the time, they will try to push. And whenever they push in the past, we have played knight to e5 and all of the King's Gambit accepted lines. But knight to e5 is no longer possible because this pawn is already on d6. So you might be thinking, okay, well, we are just going to jump into g5 then, we don't care. But suddenly they play pawn to f6, and if you take a look at the squares for the knight, you will realize we don't have any squares left, and the knight is going to fall. It's actually still playable for white, even though we are losing the knight, but I wouldn't recommend going for this. So basically that means that if you are playing against the Fischer defense, and your opponent has studied this, and they play this early d6, they try to capture, they play g5, g4, you will have to accept that, okay, we have to move the knight back to g1. And this is one of those variations that I think it's worth studying a little bit if you want to play the King's Gambit, because if you get this and you have never studied this, yeah, you are going to be in trouble most likely. So we are going to put the knight back on g1. And then the plan is pretty simple. First of all, we are basically threatening to recapture this, so black has to defend it with the bishop. And we are just going to continue with normal development. Knight to c3. A popular move for black is c6, preventing the knight from coming in. And then, of course, we want to develop this knight again. So we are going to play knight to e2, so that we can try to recapture this pawn, because now we have two attackers, which basically forces black into playing this queen to f6. Because it's pretty much the only move, right, that defends this pawn on f4. And this position is equal. So if you remember that you can get this position and you can get to this point, you will be fine. There is not really any problem playing against the Fischer defense. But you have to play this pretty crazy idea with pawn to e5. So pawn to e5, we are trying to attack the queen. Okay, I know they can capture the pawn, but we are doing this because we have basically a tactical sequence. We are going to play the knight to e4, attack the queen. The queen is forced to move, and then we are just going to move the other knight. And the entire goal for us is to make sure that, well, we don't lose quickly, so we want to make sure our king is safe. And by maneuvering the knights like this, all of a sudden we are actually safe and we have a bit more space. On the other hand, okay, we also lost 2 pawns. So we are behind 2 pawns, but we will be able to recapture them. One line, for example, is black playing this pawn to f5. We just go here with the knight, takes, 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 and then we can take here. And still, we are behind 2 pawns, but if you start looking at this, like, what is this for black? This is not really doing anything for them. And at the same time, we do have the queen. Here, we can play the bishop here. The rook is already active. We have some pressure on this as well. So, yeah, it's a special line. The engine is even saying that white is winning here, even though we are down 2 pawns. So this is a variation I would recommend you study if you want to play the King's Gambit. Next up is the Falkbeer counter gambit, which is a really popular way for black to try and destroy the King's Gambit. And many players fear playing the King's Gambit because of this Falkbeer counter gambit as well. But I think I have found a way that even without a lot of study, you can prevent running into any troubles. So there is a lot of theory about this opening in general, especially for the black side, but I would recommend as white that you just play the knight to f3. Most of the time, the player with the white pieces will, well, they can capture here, they can capture here, but you can quickly run into trouble, especially because you are basically playing into your opponent's opening preparation. But if you play knight to f3, most of the time they will be confused on what to do next. Their preparation is not going to work, and we were already able to prevent some of those lines where the queen gives the early check on h4. Most of the time, black will capture because, of course, they think, while we are capturing the pawn, also attacking the knight, it looks quite good. It's also not a bad move, but this is our plan. It's also possible they take this pawn on d4, in which case we are always going to capture here. Most of the time they take with the queen, you can attack them with the knight, and it's not really difficult to play a position like this. You don't need a lot of theory. And if they play if they play with the queen to d5, you can play this. Sometimes they can also play an early knight f6, but if you want to know a bit more about that, you can always check out this Leach's study with the link in the pinned comment. So we are going to continue here with our line where black takes, and we are going to capture this with the knight. And this is my plan, because if we play this, black will basically be out of opening preparation most likely, and that's a good thing for us because we don't want to run into any traps that they have prepared. So it's black to move. The material is equal. Most of the time you will probably see something like bishop to d6. You might also see knight to f6, but none of these lines are really complicated for white. They attack our knight, and we have a really beautiful move here, which is pawn to d4. And we can basically play this pretty much against anything that black tries. And the idea is just that we want to set up a really strong center. And the best way for black to challenge this is to capture en passant with the pawn, in which case we can still develop the bishop. They might develop the knight, we can castle, they can castle, knight to c3. There's actually basically no theory you have to know. If you just play the normal looking developing moves, you will always be fine. And that is why I think it's best to play knight to f3 against the Falkbeer counter gambit. And then we have one more variation to take a look at, which is known as the classical variation, and that is if black plays the bishop to c5. And we have already seen that the bishop to c5 is quite a tricky move, because they are aiming at this square, they're also aiming at g1, so castling is not always possible. And sometimes if the queen also comes in, we can run into some problems. So we are going to take a look at how to deal with this. Of course, still we are going to play knight to f3. It's our most logical move. And a lot of players actually go wrong here. They try to take. But yeah, we just got the d4 push, and this is all we ever wanted, right? We just have this. They have to move the bishop, and we can basically have a really good game. Sometimes they also play knight to c6, but we have already covered those variations basically right at the start of this video. So the most interesting approach by black is if they play the pawn to d6. And this is different from what we have seen before, because now black is both protecting this with the pawn and also bringing out the bishop first. So that is why this is a bit different. Because the previous lines we have analyzed was this, with the bishop still stuck here, or this, but with the pawn still on d7. So what are we going to do here? This is a bit different from what we have seen before, but it's basically the same idea as always, that we want to push this pawn to d4. But yeah, it's not really a good moment right now to push this, because if we push this, they can take. I know you can think, well, you can recapture with the knight, but yeah, it's not really the most solid position. Sometimes you can also run into some tactics and those lines. So we are actually going to play pawn to c3 so that we can prepare the push to d4. And then black will most of the time play knight to c6. They can also play knight to f6, but it doesn't really matter what they play. We are going to play the pawn to d4, and we are going to try and really build the strongest center we possibly can. So for example, here pawn to d4. They can take, we can recapture, and this of course already looks quite promising for white. This is basically everything we want with the King's Gambit. The best move for black is to go bishop b6, but many players also go wrong and they give you this check. But yeah, we just get an extra developed piece and everything is fine. By the way, if they go to the b6 square, you can still develop, play something like this, and you can already just see how we have all of our pieces on the most beautiful squares. We have the most space, we have the strongest center, so this is always fun to play from the white side. If you want to learn more about the King's Gambit, you should also check out my King's Gambit Accepted video. And as I said, the top pinned comment of this video is a link to the lead chess study with even more variations that you can take a look at.